Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here and braving the weather to come spend some time with me today. So I'll start off with a little bit about who I am. So I'm originally from Victoria, BC. I had worked in treaty negotiations with the BC government, specifically the Ministry of Aboriginal Relations and Reconciliation. And you may think I'm crazy, but 4 years ago, I decided to move to Calgary, regardless of the weather outside. I joined CEDA, an oil and gas service company, and was tasked with developing their Indigenous inclusion strategy. So why we're here, mainly why we're here is I want to share my experience about developing that strategy. So coming from, I think it's a pretty unique perspective. I started with a government that had 100% buy-in for Indigenous inclusion. Not only was there buy-in, it was our mandate. There was a legal, social, economic reason for why we were engaging communities in the province. And I moved into a company that, you know, there was some awareness maybe around the board level, a little bit with the executive, but really no previous existing strategy and really not an operational level awareness at all. We'll briefly look at the impact of the duty to consult and why that has an impact on the industry, and then further onto contractors like the company I was working with. Also in the impact of some of the political environment we're in right now. We'll look at why an organization should support Indigenous inclusion and some of those industry pressures. Also, hopefully we can consider some things, and I can share some examples on how you can take things back to your own organization and why Indigenous inclusion should be important for your group. So to start, we'll look at the duty to consult and accommodate. This really is a duty that resides, it's a constitutional duty that resides with the government. This is when anytime the Crown decides to make a decision on a land base or a resource development that could impact Indigenous rights, treaty rights, there is a requirement for them to consult that impacted group. In our current environment, we notice that the government has passed this on to industry quite frequently, mainly in the ability to let the industry engage early, build that relationship to help the process move through delays that could happen if the consultation wasn't there in advance. Industry also takes on a bit of this in some of their own legal agreements that they create through impact benefit agreements with directly impacted communities, Indigenous communities. And then really where the focus of the conversation today for me is, and this is where my previous work in the last 4 years has been, is in that contractor world. So the contractor can sometimes be passed down some of this duty through government to industry and then from industry to the contractor. This would exist in bidding requirements, whether it's a contractual agreement, reporting requirements back up into the client. Beyond the duty to the consult, we're also in a new environment. Under the Truth and Reconciliation report, there was a call to action, and of those call to actions, there's 94 recommendations. Recommendation 92 specifically spoke to business and reconciliation. Our current government the federal government has adapted all of these recommendations and is putting additional pressure on business to look into these three recommendations that come out of, or three parts of this recommendation 92. So of the three parts, there's meaningful consultation. That is, anytime you're entering into an economic development project, engage those impacted communities. Beyond that, there's equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities from the corporate sector, especially in that economic development space. Also, the recommendation looks to the corporate sector to educate their own employees on the history of Aboriginal people in Canada and understand why there is a need to engage and consult. An important part of this recommendation is that it does focus on that economic development space, but the recommendation is to the corporate sector at whole, and once again increasing that pressure on industry to consult with Indigenous communities. Also looking at our current political environment, we've seen a shift in government's attitudes recently. Both federal and provincially, we have governments wanting to pursue a new relationship of reconciliation with Indigenous communities. We've also seen increased social activism, protests, media coverage of protests, along with recent legal decisions that have heavily favored Indigenous rights, all lead towards increased pressure on industry to consult. So where does that leave us as the contractor, as that below the industry, not really in that legal or regulatory space, but feeling that increased pressure in industry. Increased pressure on industry means increased pressure on that contractor and all other industry partners. We're moving from a space where when a company would bid on work on an economic development project, there might be a nice to have, what is your Indigenous inclusion strategy, what is your workforce representation, to a more, I believe that we're moving to a current environment of it, it's going to be a need to have to win those bidding requirements. That leads us to, as the contractor, what is our business case for Indigenous inclusion? With increased pressure from industry, I believe that there's a stronger and stronger case for developing an Indigenous strategy within this service sector space. So when you look at what the business case is for your own organization, I do believe it's unique. And that you have to look at two different components to find your own business case. Those two components are, how can Indigenous inclusion align with your strategic goals, and how can Indigenous inclusion provide economic value to your organization? Breaking it down a little bit further, alignment with strategic goals. Grounding your Indigenous inclusion strategy and your strategic goals gives it strength. It makes it so that it's not just based on corporate social responsibility. I do not believe that this lessens the importance of corporate social responsibility, but alone, without providing that strategic alignment to your business objectives, you don't have the ability to provide resources, you won't have the same strength to request resources to pursue these initiatives. And also, when you have it grounded in the same kind of common language in the business objectives, you're able to communicate the why across all levels of the organization. This is a way to help create buy-in and awareness for your strategy. Economic value. If you're contributing to the economic value of your organization through your Indigenous inclusion strategy, you're going to have sustainable support. This isn't something, if it's contributing to the bottom line, this isn't something that's going to be one of the first things cut when we get into a current economic environment like this, where we have the downturn and there's additional pressures to cut. We notice that if there's a value that you can drive that it will continue on regardless of the climate, then you will actually be able to have the resources throughout the entire organization. And here's some examples of what the economic value could be. So again, back to that competitive advantage. When we're looking at bidding on work for clients who are trying to meet that duty to consult obligation that's been passed down to the government, they're looking to meet some of their commitments that they've made to Indigenous communities. And so if you're also providing them value through workforce representation, spend in Indigenous communities, community investment, partnerships with Indigenous businesses, you're going to have a competitive advantage when we're in a very tight price competitive market. Also, we can look at new business opportunities. If you're engaging with Aboriginal businesses, they may have opportunities that you don't have, and through your partnership, you would gain a new stream to that work. Supplier diversity can create some price competition between increasing numbers of suppliers. You're also, again, working your way back into that Indigenous spend if you're working with Aboriginal businesses through your subcontracting and vendor relationships. A really important one is accessing local labor. So this is a missed opportunity. When I started with my company, we were doing fly-in and fly-out from Newfoundland. We had temporary foreign worker visas, and we weren't actually taking advantage of the opportunity of the local labor pool that was right in front of us in Indigenous communities. There was no active recruitment process for that. Why this was a missed opportunity is very clear when you look at some of the stats. The Indigenous population between 2006 and 2011 grew 4 times the size of the non-Indigenous population. The Indigenous population is also, the median age of the Indigenous population is also 13 years younger than the non-Indigenous population in Canada, which is represented here with the 36.2% of the population being under the age of 24. With all of this working together, this is the fastest growing workforce segment and also one of the greatest opportunities for skill training and recruitment. How you are going to create economic value for your organization really depends on the way you're going to engage. We looked at it at a sort of a 4-pronged approach here. So starting with recruitment, was our first step. Recruitment was a way that we could engage in the community, look for opportunities to bring our Indigenous employees into the organization to help increase our culture of inclusion. It was also one of the ones that required some of the easier business decision making when we developed a diversity and inclusion policy that helped our recruitment strategy where all else equal, local and Indigenous candidates were given preferential treatment. The next step, what we saw as a natural process, was to look at that supplier, vendor, subcontractor world. I like to call it the trial run. Before you're looking at considering a partnership, to look to see if the capacity, skills, and business opportunities align through that supplier or vendor relationship is quite a great opportunity here. The next step is commitment to growth through community investment. This could be capacity training, skills development. It's really just showing that you're there to build a partnership, you're trying to establish a relationship with the community that you're looking to engage, and that this is a long-term thing. I believe that all three of these things feed into an overall partnership, which is really building a relationship based on mutual benefit. Some of the lessons learned in developing this Indigenous inclusion strategy, the biggest and the most important one for me was policy does not equal culture. So I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but some people, when you read it on the piece of paper on your first day on onboarding, doesn't necessarily mean you'll remember it a couple months later, or does it mean you'll put it into practice. So just because we had executive buy-in, we had leadership team approve that policy, we had everyone on board that needed to be on board with the strategy, did not mean my frontline operations team understood, wanted to implement, or even was actually aware of the policy and the strategy. So I think the biggest point that I took home from this one was that communication is really key. So it needs to be top-down communication. Everyone from the leadership team to the frontline laborer needs to understand that this is a goal of the organization. Next one for me is diversity is not Indigenous inclusion. So while a lot of companies can look to engage a lot of other diverse groups and underrepresented groups in Canada, there is a unique social and economic business case for Indigenous inclusion, which I think creates its own importance and momentum and why it should be handled on its own separately with its own specific resources. This is also a favorite of mine. Haven't lost a bid yet. It was my favorite saying that I would hear from operations when I was trying to get them to change their ways. So I do understand that in some cases, especially in the service world, this hasn't hit the ground yet in terms of them losing bids to their clients. But I don't believe that that's where our economic environment is going or our social environment's going. My always answer was, well, do you want to wait until you have? So I think that it's about overcoming that obstacle and recognizing really that's the business case, showing that economic value, grounding it back in those strategic goals, so explaining that this is the reason why we're moving forward with this strategy. Some more internal lessons learned within the organization was you have to find your champions. So not everyone will accept or believe in the Indigenous inclusion strategy or the resources being put towards it, but there will be pockets of people in every part of the organization who will understand the need. So looking at it, you have to find people within your board, your executive, your operations, human resources to get that recruitment piece going, supply chain to get that vendor-supplier relationship going, and of course operations so that it is being implemented throughout the entire organization. Next one requires dedicated resources. So I do think that while different departments can handle Indigenous inclusion on their own and their own piece of it that they own, if there isn't a group or an individual or a champion for Indigenous inclusion with your organization, you do lose that foot off the gas momentum. I think that you have to show commitment. I think it shows dedication to the communities you're engaging, that there is someone that is solely dedicated to this person that they can go to if there's issues to overcome. The next one is the ability to be flexible and creative. When I was starting with this strategy, there were unbelievable amount of barriers in getting it off the ground, and you have to be able to problem solve. And if you don't have the mandate to be creative, you will never really be able to overcome those barriers. An example of where we overcame obstacles was our CEDA's Aboriginal Operator Training Program. So we were having really great success with our recruitment, but we were constantly noticing that we couldn't advance some of our Aboriginal candidates beyond that entry-level labor position. And in my opinion, true inclusion means advancement throughout the entire organization. One of the biggest barriers for our candidates to move out of that labor position into an operator position was a Class 1 or Class 3 driver's license. So we looked at a solution of partnering with the Aboriginal Skills and Employment Training Strategy, and looked at our, so if you don't know that program, it's a federally run program. It's federally funded. The bands are given, asset holders are throughout all of the provinces, and they work in conjunction with the band to approve training for individuals from the band or the Métis settlement to go through anywhere up to 52 weeks of training. And they'll be supported financially while they do that. So we decided that some of our Shining Star candidates, employees who came in, or employees who had shown great potential, that we would provide them with a letter of opportunity. That letter of opportunity said to the asset holder, we're willing to invest in this candidate if you are. So they had 6 months to go receive that license, and when they came back, they would be paired with a CEDA senior operator for 6 months of on-the-job training. So not only was this an absolutely amazing way for us to develop a strengthening and strengthen our relationships in the communities we were engaging on a recruitment process, but it was a way to show that we're willing to invest in our Indigenous employees and that we're wanting to advance them, and also that the band would also be signaling that they were wanting to invest in those employees well. So it was really a mutual investment with mutual benefit. Oh, this is... Okay, we're just gonna, it's out of order, but we'll do that. So this is, when we look, lastly, I just wanna sort of discuss what success looks like in an Indigenous inclusion strategy. And I think that, when we talk about success, we usually talk about how we measure it. When we're measuring success, we like to use metrics, and sometimes metrics can be good and sometimes they can be bad. Metrics can create accountability, but they can also, if you create things like quotas, can create a bias that has unintended consequences. So at CEDA, when we were working on our recruitment strategy, we were looking at how would we measure this across all of our regions. We landed on a percentage base across the entire organization. With that, we were actually successful in developing a voluntary self-declaration form. So again, voluntary, which is the way to proceed. And then with that, we collected that data and reported it as a whole unit number. We were successful in the last 3 years of increasing our recruitment of 10% of new hires were self-declaring as Indigenous for the last 3 years. So that's a really quite impressive number when you look at population status comparatively. But what I was worried about when I was developing this process and how we were going to report was there was pressure from operations to say, well, what about hiring 5 people in this region and 5 people in this region and making it so it was reported to keep people accountable. And you really want to be careful when establishing your metrics because you don't want to have those unintended consequences and actually negative impact the culture of inclusion by creating things like quotas. Now we're just going to go backwards. So when we look at success, I think that there is a need to redefine how we look at success when it comes to an Indigenous inclusion strategy. Part of it is how have you moved the needle? Are we better off than we were before? One of my favorite examples of this is within the first month of starting my job with CEDA, the vice president of the health, safety, and environment came into my office and he was talking about a training initiative that he had launched previously where they were going into remote northern communities and offering training on the safety certifications that you needed to come on board to be an employee with CEDA. He had mentioned that in one of the communities they had entered into was an Indigenous community and that they had had 12 people sign up. And I was so excited to hear this because I was like, okay, I'm not even here yet and they're already going into Indigenous communities and they're offering training. This is great. We're going down the right path here. And he said, yeah, but we only had 2 people graduate. And I said, 2 people graduated? This is great. What do you mean? And he couldn't understand my enthusiasm. And that's because we created 2 champions that day. 2 champions that were going to come work for CEDA, help us to increase our culture of Indigenous inclusion, but also go back into that community. So I guarantee you the next time that we were in that community offering training, there would be more than 12 people signed up and likely more than 2 that would graduate. Another great way to consider where you're at with your Indigenous inclusion strategy and if you're successful or not is to look at some third-party measurements. So I've come across all 3 of these in my time with CEDA, and they all have different metrics. So Northeastern Alberta Aboriginal Business Association has the best practice indicators. Indigenous Works, which is formerly Aboriginal Human Resource Council, has their workplace diagnostics where they let you know where you are on the continuum. We also have the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, which has the Progressive Aboriginal Relations tiers. So all of these things can provide some validation for your strategy. I don't necessarily think that you need them, but if you're in a place in your organization where you're looking at how do I gain support, how do I build momentum, how do I even start the conversation, these can be really effective tools. So in conclusion, when I talk about this sort of space, I just think that I will hope that you have some ideas for how to build the business case and gain support for Indigenous inclusion within your own organization, thinking about that, aligning with strategic value, connecting it to your finding those economic values that can help contribute to the bottom line of your organization. Also, I hope that it's created a platform to begin the conversation to increase the inclusion and also help you find your champions within your organization. And remember, regardless of where you are in your strategy or the successes you're having, celebrate them regardless of the size, because that's the most important part in advancing and making sure you continue to move forward. Okay, so now on to questions.
We've had lots of time for questions based on learnings from last year. And there was a few people that emailed that could not be here because of the cold and other things. And they had a couple of really good questions. So okay. I'm going to, normally don't do this, but I want to pull a little bit of rank and ask you one that's very poignant to what's going on.
Okay.
And just so everybody can hear it. You have a, I'd rather not be up here. Thanks. And then after, like usual, just raise your hand and we'll pass you the microphone. But the question put forward was, looking at beyond inclusion, what are areas businesses could benefit from traditional knowledge of First Nations in the way that they operate their business practices, which I thought was a great question.
Yeah, it definitely is a great question. That's a challenging one because I think that in the space that I'm speaking from, in that contractor world, finding support for Indigenous inclusion can be difficult enough. Beyond that, trying to adjust and modify business practices to incorporate those traditional knowledge, traditional practices. But the benefit really does come down to that relationship building and showing that you are invested in creating a strong, healthy relationship within the Indigenous, within your Indigenous community partners.
So questions?
Oh.
Everything's a slam dunk.
Oh, there we go.
Was your strategy development aimed primarily at Indigenous people that lived on reserves or off reserves, or was it a mixture? And maybe you could comment on the different approaches that might be needed depending on where they live.
Of course, yeah. So I would say that, specifically recruitment obviously is what you're thinking of in that space. So with our recruitment strategy, we really did not have a targeted group, whether it was on reserve or not reserve. It was actually just proximity to our projects. We were looking at moving away from that fly-in model and looking for the economic advantages of a local labor force. And so with that, we used a couple of different tools. We did a campaign directly into the employment services, offered it on reserve and with the band functions. But we would also attend Aboriginal specific career fairs all throughout the province. And so we weren't really targeting one or the other, but we were just looking for candidates who were willing to come and work with CEDA regardless of where they were located, but how close they wanted to be to our projects.
Other questions?
Just from a practical perspective, when it comes to the contracting, let's say, I don't know, you're putting a pipe in the ground or something, would you go, say there's 10 contractors, would you say 2 of those contracts have to go to Aboriginal businesses, or how would you incorporate Aboriginal business to bid on that? Do you allocate a certain amount, or do you just make it known that those contracts are open?
So we in our procurement policy took a very similar approach to our recruitment strategy, where we said all else equal, we gave preference to local Aboriginal and then Aboriginal businesses. So it wasn't necessarily, again, allocating a certain amount of that work. That, I think, falls more into that industry level where they have made a certain commitment to the communities. Really in that tiered approach of responsibility and commitment, I find that industry makes very more targeted commitments to the Indigenous communities, which then get passed down to all of the contractors that they bring on, for example, CEDA being one of them. And all we're trying to do is help that client meet their commitments. So for us, we're really looking at that best practices approach, where it's just always looking at the best candidate for the job and then giving preferential treatment.
Any creative suggestions on the challenge around self-disclosure?
Yes, that's a fun question. It is, I struggled with my legal team for over a year on this one. Really what it came down to for us was that voluntary piece and how the information was stored and how it was accessed by leaders. So we had it so that only very few people within HR have actually information into that employee's profile. So it's a hidden field within their profile. And of course the voluntary information, we have it right on the page, right on the form that says this information is collected, and we give the purposes that it's collected for, and we say that it's confidential and that we will never disclose an individual's own status, but we will collectively report what our statistics are and that we're using it for socioeconomic advantages.
Excellent. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. J.R. Hammond from Imaginary Energy. One of our main focuses has been inclusion and the collaborative side with the Indigenous population moving forward. I was wondering if you could comment on the model proposed. What are the challenges that you currently experience, and any recommendations using this model going forward?
So in terms of challenges, I think that the biggest ones were, back to some of that policy does not equal culture. Just because you have buy-in for inclusion does not mean you've created a culture where people there is an inclusiveness for Indigenous suppliers, employees. So it's how do you change the language around your strategy, and that's where I think aligning it with the easiest way for me to create buy-in with my own organization was making sure people understood that we were doing this to better off the entire company. This wasn't being done because it was a requirement of the client. It was doing it because we were a better business for it. And I think that when you're thinking about different challenges, it's about just really getting those resources to put towards the project. If you're doing it off the side of your desk or there's not an effort being made, then you're not going to be successful. So I hope that helps. Sorry.
So beyond the resources that you might need, can you give us specific ways in which you can actually change that culture?
Yeah, so communication and the language around the strategy, how the strategy is shared within the organization, how successes are shared within the organization. For example, when we had our first graduate of our Aboriginal operator training program, we did a profile on him and put him in the newsletter, had his picture there standing with the trucks, and, beaming smile, proud to become a new operator for CEDA. So I think that's part of it. What the biggest eye-opening part for me is that once we were successful in the self-declaration process and getting that part in. The amount of leaders that actually came forward and started to self-identify openly within the organization, because they then saw that we were moving towards this way in the company, and that it was something that was not only recognized, but it was actually appreciated, and they saw the value in sharing that information. So pieces like that, making it so that there is a positive association with inclusion, so that people start to feel comfortable about sharing their own stories.
Other questions? We'll take one more after.
Hi. See, I have a question regarding the permanency of community supports. I'm just wondering, is there an element of temporary community supports? For example, after the project ends, does that mean the community supports are no longer ongoing? Or I'm just wondering about that.
And it's obviously, once again, it's a bit of a different space when you're looking at it from this contractor perspective. But I do believe that the reason why you engage a community should be to create that long-lasting relationship, whether it be for partnering with an Indigenous business so that you're co-bidding on projects in the future. That means that once that project's done, there'll be something else that you want to work on together again, because you've created that joint relationship. Also, if you're investing in a community when it comes to skills or capacity development, that's going to benefit your organization regardless of the project, because you're creating talented employees in that community that will continue to benefit your community or your organization. So I think it's how you approach community investment. If it's almost back to that metrics piece. If you're doing something just to meet a quota or just to meet a certain spend number, that's not sustainable. But if you're doing it for an economic reason, for that mutual benefit of relationship building, then that does create a sustainable, lasting approach.
I understand that there's usage more up north, and in one instance, they built an educational institution so that locals can attend and further their education and then become a part of the research studies and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So, and so I think that partnership would be really important in the long term, the ongoing long term. So that would be an interesting, that would be, in my mind, a need to have criteria.
I agree, and I think in the sort of the model that was presented, the community investment part was that commitment to growth, and when you're committing to growth, that means you're sticking around, because that's what you're there for the long run. And so I do agree that it doesn't necessarily need to have an immediate payoff of community investment, but that is what the point of it is, to signal a long-lasting relationship.
Well, that's great to know. Thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you.
One last question? We'll do a couple. We'll go there, and then these two will finish that.
This is what I get for being quick.
When you are contemplating engagement with an Indigenous community, how do you factor in their own sense of governance, their own sense of culture, and their own sense of heritage in respect to that?
Of course.
Understanding that that's completely different.
So I do agree. Obviously there is a wide spectrum of different political environments, different appetites for economic development across all of the communities. It is interesting because in the service world, there's actually quite a few different communities that will be proactive, and they'll approach companies like CEDA looking for joint ventures or partnerships. But I saw the strategy that I proposed was that we look at the best fit example. So who are we working for? Who do they have impact benefit agreements with? Who are our clients already partnered with? And is there an opportunity for us to also form our own relationship with those groups? Of course, then you have to consider whether you're working with a First Nation band that's in their governance structure, or if it's a Métis settlement, or in some cases it's just an Aboriginal business that isn't actually connected to the community but still has some importance within the community from the chief and council perspective. So I do think that it is important to consider that, but from the perspective that CEDA was operating at was where are we looking at, where are we best aligned to mutually benefit based on our clients and the projects we're working on.
Hi, you've made it sound very sort of simple, and not simple. You made it sound relatively smooth, but I'm sure it wasn't. What were some of the criticisms you received from inside the organization or from the community? What were some of the mistakes that you made?
Okay, that's a good question. Criticism number one from inside, why are we doing this? Almost every day you had to answer that question. And I think that's why you have to have a really good elevator pitch ready for most operational leaders. But I think that some of the mistakes we made was originally I did just work with the executive leadership group, and really I felt that their enthusiasm and the board enthusiasm was enough. And it was that lack of communication to the operation level that was our biggest mistake in trying to get some of these things to move forward. I also think trying to make everything perfect before you implement. It's not necessarily going to be okay. With the self-declaration form, we went through 3 different versions of the form. If we had waited till it was perfect, we would never even started collecting statistics, and then we couldn't report. As soon as we were reporting statistics, and CEDA could proudly say that they were hiring over 10% self-declared Aboriginal employees, that created momentum so that we could continue down that process and get even more buy-in. Sorry, what was the other part of your question? The mistake. Oh, the community, yeah. Community, where we engaged the community in the most was on the recruitment side. And what I think the hardest part is that, we would develop these initiatives, we would have this program, and then in a downturn when hiring would freeze, they were still looking to us as an employer that they could send resumes through and knew that they would get results for their community members. So the biggest criticism from the community was, how can we keep the relationship going when there is a downturn, when there's a hiring freeze? And that's where we really struggled. There isn't really a perfect solution to that other than, letting them know of every opportunity that comes up. And it was just that sort of individual relationship and that relationship building, letting them know that we will let you know of opportunities when they do start happening again. This isn't the end of the relationship, it's just a pause. And sort of communicating with a couple of the organizations and communities that I worked with, we looked at, here's some training that community members can go and look into while there's not an opportunity, so that they are in a position to be employable when we do get back into a hiring world.
Last question. Hi, I was wondering, I guess I'm a little bit confused. I thought I was coming to a meeting with Indigenous inclusion, and I don't see a lot of Indigenous people here. So I guess, how are you going to do that? How are we going to have inclusion with Indigenous people if they're not here?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, one of the things that I actually, even have some of my own self-consciousness around is I am not Indigenous in an Indigenous relations role. And, there's conversations and articles floating around on LinkedIn that says that shouldn't be the case. And it is a challenge, and I think that we have to look as organizations, when I talk about how we engage across all levels in advancing our Indigenous employees, that's a big piece of it. And looking at supporting that capacity development so that people do come into these roles more frequently. In terms of the audience, that's a tough question. I'm not sure if I have an answer for you for that one.
Yeah, maybe I should answer. Sorry, I'm just getting over a cold. I will say that the university has strict rules about how we engage about events. And so we can't just send out a blanket email to anybody to say, come to this event. We have to be respectful of FOIA rules. So in order to have somebody included into our mailing list, you'll see in the white sheets for feedback that there's a part that says, would you like to be added to our mailing list? Now, the way that we've garnered people to come that aren't on that mailing list is if you were to join that mailing list and I send you an invitation to one of our events, we don't discriminate or target any specific group to come to an event. We just look at the topics and then say, we'll build it, we'll send it out. If you are on our mailing list, then you are free to forward that on to whoever. But we cannot, as a center, do that, unfortunately. It is one of the stipulations we have. It's a sucky one, of course. And we do try to communicate the best we can through our native center, so we do use our internal partners as well. So I know it's not a great answer, but it is part of the restrictions that we have when we have invitations sent out. And it's not a reflection on you, Bailey, it's more a reflection on our center. Hope that makes sense. So with that in mind, so we don't have an echo. Please do fill out your cards before you go, and stay safe. It's really cold out there, and you braved your time to come and to see Bailey. She's going to stick around for a little bit longer, so I do encourage you to come up if you want to continue the conversation with her. She is available for about an hour, and even though she has left momentarily the energy industry to go to AHS.
Got it.
She has a strong heart for this. She's very authentic in what she's doing, and she's willing to connect and help into this realm. So please do engage her if you want to continue this conversation. So with that being said, please give us your feedback, drive safe, and join me in thanking Bailey Quaite for her time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.